The morning unfolded with a fragile stillness, the kind that draped itself across the savannah like a veil. The grass moved in gentle waves under the touch of a slow breeze, the world caught between silence and waking life. It was then, breaking through the rhythm of insects and distant bird calls, that a sound rose faintly above it all. It was small, strained and trembling, so thin it could almost have been mistaken for the creak of branches. But it was not the wind, and it did not belong to the grass. It was the cry of something young, something struggling, carrying just enough desperation to make those listening stop in their tracks. The rangers knew the land well, their ears trained to separate the ordinary from the urgent. They moved toward the sound, their boots brushing softly against the earth, careful not to disturb more than necessary. Each step was measured, guided by instinct and caution, until the grass parted before them and revealed what no one wished to see. There, half hidden in a tangle of brittle stalks, lay a lion cub. He was no older than a few months, his frame small and his body pressed low against the ground as though it might hide him. One paw was pulled unnaturally to the side, bound by a snare of twisted wire. The cruel loop clung to his leg with a grip that had already bitten deep into flesh, the metal sharp against the softness of his youth. His fur around the wound was stained dark with dried blood, and the soil nearby told the rest of the story. Claw marks gouged into the earth where he had fought, patches of grass torn free, each trace of struggle a reminder of how long he had been caught. His chest rose and fell quickly, each breath shallow and uneven, the rhythm of an animal on the edge of exhaustion. His eyes, half-glazed, met the figures that stood before him, but did not register relief or hope. They carried only the haze of fear and weariness. When his body shifted, it was not to lunge or flee, but only a twitch of muscle too weak to carry him anywhere. The men stopped a few paces away, crouching slightly, lowering their shape to appear smaller in his presence. Their silence was heavy, the air between them charged not with fear of him, but with sorrow for what had been done. One of them let his voice slip into the stillness, soft and nearly broken by the weight of it. "Easy, little one. We see you." The words were not meant to comfort in the way humans speak to each other. They were only meant to soften the air, to replace the harshness of wire and blood with something less threatening, something steady. The cub did not respond, not with sound nor with movement. But his ears flicked faintly, his body acknowledging the presence around him. The rangers knew that was enough for now. They did not press closer. To rush was to deepen the fear, to add panic to a body already weakened by struggle. Instead, they let the quiet stretch, their eyes fixed on the cruel snare and the small leg it held hostage. Above them, the sun climbed steadily, spilling its light across the scene. The wire glinted where it caught the rays, a thin line of metal shining cold against the warm earth. It was a stark reminder of why they were there. Human hands had set this trap, hidden in grass without care for what it would catch. It could have been a hare, it could have been nothing. But today it had been a cub, his life held hostage by something without thought or mercy. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and the faint tang of blood. The rangers drew in slow breaths, steadying themselves for what would come. They had found him alive, and that was something. But the snare had done its work well, and now every decision would matter. For now, though, they did nothing but remain with him in the grass, the sun rising higher above them, the cruel circle of wire holding its grip as though the land itself had gone still. The cub's body jerked once more, a sudden desperate pull against the metal that bound him. The wire tightened cruelly, drawing a low moan from his throat before he slumped into the grass again, too weak to rise. The movement sent a ripple of tension through the air, and the rangers froze where they were, holding themselves still as the savannah seemed to lean in around them. They knew the danger of this moment was not only in the steel-cutting flesh, but in fear itself, a young animal terrified enough to fight until no strength remained. They crouched a few feet away, shoulders lowered, their silence heavy but steady. The only sounds now were the steady drone of insects, the faint stirring of wind through the grass, and the cub's quick, uneven breaths. They did not speak, did not rush. This part required stillness, Patience stretched thin across the urgency of knowing every second mattered. The cub's tail twitched against the dirt, a nervous, broken rhythm. His nostrils flared slowly, testing the sense around him. A half-growl caught in his throat, raw and unformed, yet enough to speak his fear more clearly than words ever could. These signs, though fragile, reminded the Rangers of what they were working to preserve. A life that had not yet given up. The older Ranger let his pack slip to the ground, movements measured, deliberate, each one careful not to startle. He unrolled a length of cloth, frayed at the edges, worn smooth from use, its purpose simple, to shield, to soften the harsh bite of tools against the cub's skin. His hands did not shake. Beside him, another Ranger steadied a short pole, not as a weapon but as a barrier, a gentle extension of space should the cub thrash or lunge in panic. They had come prepared, not with violence, but with tools tempered by years of rescue. The cub's ears flicked, catching the faint rustle of fabric. His wide eyes stayed fixed on the humans before him, the whites showing as his chest lifted and fell. Still, he did not bolt, bound as he was by the cruel wire. The moment stretched long and thin, every heartbeat counted. One Ranger lowered his voice barely more than a breath. "Stay." The word was not command, but reminder that calmness was their only ally, that panic would serve neither human nor animal. Gradually, the cub's trembling slowed. His breaths remained shallow, but his body no longer jerked against the ground. Exhaustion weighed heavier now than fear, dragging his small frame into stillness. He blinked slowly, lids heavy, the sharpness of resistance dulled by weariness. His tail stilled, his ears sagging against his head as the fight bled from him in quiet surrender. The Rangers exchanged a glance, wordless but clear. For the first time since they had found him, the cub seemed to be giving them space, if only for a moment. They did not celebrate it. Trust, if it could be called that, was fragile here, a brief thread woven from necessity. But in that thread lay their chance. The men leaned closer into the silence, their breaths steady, their presence steadying the wild heart before them. The world around seemed to pause, holding them in its balance. The cub, the wire, the humans waiting on the edge of his fear. The silence that had settled over the grassland broke with the faint scrape of metal. The Ranger's knife touched the wire, careful and slow, its edge sliding against the coiled steel that had dug so deep into the cub's leg. The moment the sound reached him, the cub's body tensed sharply. His muscles drew tight, his claws pressed weakly into the dirt, and his breathing quickened, each breath short and fragile. He did not thrash, but every fiber of his frame braced against the contact. Fear and pain bound together in one small body. The Ranger leaned closer, steadying his hands, though the sight before him pulled heavy at the chest. The wire had cut deep, leaving swollen flesh ridged and angry. Dried blood clung to fur, clotted in rough patches that told of hours spent struggling alone. Each mark around him, torn soil, flattened grass, streaks where his paw had scraped in desperation, was a silent record of how long the snare had held him. The cub moaned softly, the sound so thin it seemed almost too small for the weight of suffering it carried. His head sank lower, his nose brushing the ground, breaths quivering through half-open lips. Yet he did not snap or fight against the hands that worked near him. His stillness was not trust, but exhaustion. The blade pressed again, angling carefully to catch the first strand of wire. There was a pause, then a sharp metallic snap, and the coil shifted. The cub jolted, a tremor racing through his frame. His ears flicked back, his eyes widened, but he did not rise. The Rangers stilled with him, pulling back for a moment, their movements measured. One whispered under his breath, words soft and almost indistinct. "Steady now." The sound was not a command, but a rhythm, something to fill the space between them with quiet rather than tension. Another strand yielded, loosening its grip, and the cub gasped in a way only an animal can. A sudden shudder that coursed through his body without voice, as if the release itself startled him. His tail twitched weakly, pressing into the dirt, and then lay still. The Ranger's hands worked in silence, each cut made slowly, each pause allowing him to settle again. Their tools gleamed dully under the rising sun. their edges sharp against the brutality of the wire yet handled with reverence, as though every movement was a promise not to cause harm. Bit by bit, the snare fell away. With each release, the paw lay a little looser, though the skin beneath remained raw and swollen. The cub shifted once, pulling slightly as if testing the space, then let his body sink again into the grass, his sides lifting and falling in shallow rhythm. His eyes fluttered shut for a moment, the strain of it all too heavy before flicking open again to watch the figures near him. Finally, with one last unwinding, the cruel circle came free. The wire coiled back on itself, a broken shape that dropped into the dirt like something discarded. The cub's paw was left bare, though the wound around it was angry, red, and trembling. Blood welled fresh in thin lines where the flesh had been bound, and his leg quivered beneath its own weight even as it rested against the soil. The rangers drew back slightly, their tools lowered, their breaths easing, though no words marked the moment. Around them, the grass swayed softly in the breeze, returning to its natural rhythm as though reclaiming the quiet. The cub remained where he was, body pressed low, leg curled close, but the wire no longer held him. What remained was pain, yes, but also the fragile chance of survival, restored in a single act of patient release. The cub did not flee as the men expected. He stayed low in the grass, chest heaving, one paw tucked tightly beneath him as though he were still bound. The weight of his breathing carried both relief and suspicion, every rise and fall of his ribs echoing the question of whether the danger had truly passed. His eyes, dark and wide, lingered on the quiet figures around him, searching for signals of harm that never came. The rangers did not move closer. Their work was finished, yet their presence hung in the air like a final test. They stood with the same patience they had shown in cutting the wire, careful not to intrude on the fragile silence. In that stillness, the cub shifted slightly, the faint quiver of his ear betraying his awareness of every sound, every motion, every breath around him. One ranger knelt slowly, never extending a hand, only unscrewing the cap of a worn canteen. He tipped it gently, letting a thin thread of water fall to the dust at the cub's side. The earth darkened, forming a shallow pool that reflected the pale light of morning. For a moment, the cub only watched, nostrils flaring, body rigid. Then, with a slow lowering of his head, he reached forward, tongue brushing once, twice across the surface. The water rippled, and he paused again, as though tasting not only the liquid but the safety of the moment itself. It was not gratitude as humans might imagine, but something quieter, a recognition that the hands which had touched the cruel snare had not turned against him. His gaze lifted briefly toward the ranger, unblinking, uncertain, yet no longer filled with panic. Between them stretched a silence heavy with meaning, a fragile thread strung between fear and trust. The cub shifted, his muscles stiff from hours of strain. He planted his paw gingerly against the earth, testing it as though it still belonged to another. His leg trembled, bent, and nearly collapsed beneath him. The rangers did not move to steady him. They only waited, knowing that any interference might replace calm with terror. The young animal gathered himself once more, shoulders rising, hind legs pressing against the ground until, with awkward determination, he found balance. His steps were clumsy, each one measured against the pain of memory more than the wound itself. The grasses brushed against his belly as he pushed forward, stumbling, steadying, pausing again. Dust clung to his coat where he had rolled in struggle, but the wildness of his form remained, raw, untamed, unbroken. Behind him, the rangers stayed rooted in place. They had spoken little, only soft murmurs shared between them as the work unfolded. Now one allowed a single whisper to leave his lips, almost as if to the air itself. "Go on now." The words carried no command, no claim, only permission, as though the ground itself had been returned to the cub. The animal turned his head once, pausing mid-step. His ears twitched, eyes fixing again on the still figures. For a moment the scene held, man and beast, bound not by dominance or ownership, but by an unspoken understanding born from suffering relieved. Then the cub's gaze slipped away. He pressed forward, moving deeper into the tall grass that closed behind him like a curtain. The rangers remained, their silence heavier than before. The last sound was the faint rustle of stalks bending in the cub's wake, a reminder that trust, once touched, cannot be held. It can only be given space to return to the wild. The grass shifted and closed as though the earth itself wished to protect him, golden blades rising high until the cub's body was no longer visible. His passage was marked only by a soft rustle, the faint line of disturbed stems bending in his wake before springing upright again. Each step carried the awkward rhythm of recovery, a limp tempered by stubborn will, until even the sound of his movement faded into the wide silence of the savannah. Above, a bird cut through the air with a sharp, ringing cry. Its wings spread wide as it circled before drifting away. The call hung for a moment, sharp and clean, then dissolved into stillness, reclaiming the space that had been broken by hours of struggle and human presence. The land was returning to itself, absorbing the intrusion as it always did, folding the story back into its endless cycle of loss and endurance. The Rangers remained where they were, not rushing to leave. Their work, though complete, carried a weight that settled slowly. One bent to gather the coil of twisted wire, its edges dulled with dust yet still dangerous in its shape. He turned it over in his hands, the metal scarred from the force that had bound the young paw. The snare was bent now, folded into itself, a silent knot of cruelty taken from the land. He wrapped it carefully, not letting the jagged ends graze his skin, then tucked it into a canvas pouch. It would not claim another life. Nearby, another ranger crouched low, brushing his hand across the place where the cub had lain. The grass was flattened, pressed deep into the soil by hours of weight and resistance. There was no warmth left, only the faint dark trace where blood had marked the ground. He let his fingers rest there for a breath before lifting them again, leaving the space untouched, as though it belonged not to him, but to the memory of the small creature that had endured. No words passed between the men. The silence was not heavy but full, carrying the quiet recognition of what had been given and what remained uncertain. They knew the cub would walk with a scar, that his steps would always remember the wire. Yet they also knew that survival was not perfection. Survival was enough, a chance carried forward into the unknown, a thread rejoined to the wild fabric from which it had nearly been torn. The horizon stretched wide before them, grasses bending in waves that shimmered beneath the late sun. Somewhere within that vastness, the cub's family might be waiting, their forms hidden in the distance, their scents carried faintly on the moving air. Or perhaps he would wander a while before finding them, guided by instinct and the pull of life that refused to be broken. The Rangers could not know, and they did not need to. What mattered was that the choice was his again, returned to him by hands that had touched gently, then withdrawn. They began to walk back at last, their steps slow, boots brushing through the same tall grass that had swallowed the cub. The air felt lighter now, as though the land itself exhaled with them, carrying away the tension of hours spent in patience and risk. Above, the sky had softened, streaked with pale gold where the sun bent low toward evening. Behind them, the grasses whispered once more in the wind, erasing the last trace of their presence. The cub was gone, hidden within the endless wild, but the moment stayed with those who had witnessed it. A reminder, fragile yet enduring, that even in a world shaped by snares and cruelty, gentleness could still tip the balance.